Welcome to Sessions with Dolly. This is our last session in the season as we wrap up Tabo's journey. We'll be discussing how to design with purpose. Let's get on it. So the hard truth about designing with purpose is knowing that our visualizations are not about you. In the last session, we discussed in detail the importance of knowing our audience, and so as we design our visuals, we need to have our audiences in mind, because essentially it's about them, and they are the ones who need to make the decisions. So designing with purpose means that we understand what the purpose is. So our main goal is that we want to support the decision making process, right? So what action do you want your audience to take? When we design visualizations, we want to create visualizations that will allow our audiences to make decisions with ease. So let's see for a bit and remind ourselves of our audience. So in the last couple of sessions, we talked about the types of audiences that we have. We have newcomers with very low expertise who might not be familiar with the topic. Then we have people who we call generalists. So this person is neither new nor an expert in a certain topic. They just know enough about a topic, but we wouldn't necessarily consider them experts. And then we have experts, and these are people who are knowledgeable about the topic that is being discussed, and they have extensive experience in that area. So it's important to remember our audiences, because as we can see, these different types of audiences are at different skills levels, and they may perceive things differently, and we should accommodate for that. You have to think about how people perceive certain things at the level that they're at, and that is a very important aspect in designing visualizations, visual perception. So let's talk about visual perception. So visual perception essentially is the brain's ability to make sense of what the eyes see. So according to Alberto Cairo, we see with our brains. So let's just have a look at a few examples how this is applied. So here we have a picture. I'm sure everybody can attest that when you see this picture, you see a white square over four circles, and in the next one you could say you see two shapes. One, you might consider that to be a rectangle, and another one you might consider that to be a square. And then in this third picture, you see what most of us could think is a division design. So let's try and discuss these three pictures in more detail and see how visual perception actually works. So let's just discuss this picture for a bit. As we said, most of us would think that this is a white square and we have four circles. But what if I told you that there really isn't a square there at all, but only for pigment? Let's see that. So could click here, delete that, we delete that, we delete that. So obviously, as you can see, as we remove this pigment, the square automatically disappears. So this is how visual perception actually works. Because of how the pigment were arranged, we were able to see a square that really wasn't there. So let's move on to another example of a rectangle and a square. So this would be easier for eyes to pick. Okay, you see two shapes, rectangle and a square. But what if you then remove this square? You see, because it's hidden behind this L shape, like the L shaped shape was hidden behind the square, you then would assume that the part of it that appeared to the eyes was the rectangle. But really, when you remove the square, that's when you could actually see that the shape wasn't really that shape that you thought it was. Again, this is how the arrangement could work, like how you put things together and how other people from the outside look at your visual, like how it's presented and how our eyes see it. Let's look at the last example. Obviously, we can see the division sign, but if we removed the shape, you just see two dots there. So really, it was never a division sign, but it was just three different shapes. And if you remove the rectangle, you can only see two circles, and this is how, again, visual perception works, and how arranging of particular items and elements can give that visual perception of something else that's not really there. And understanding this is very important in designing our visualizations. And as we go into aspects of visual perception and some of the principles that I talked about, we can actually understand, so that we can use that to our advantage as we continue to design our visualizations. So the most discussed principles when it comes to visual perception and data visualization is the Gestalt principles of visualization, which aim to understand how individuals perceive order in the world around them. Understanding these principles is key to visual designers like us who want to design with purpose. So let's discuss these principles in detail. So the Gestalt principles explore ways in which our minds organize visual information. As mentioned previously, we see with our brains. So apparently our brains don't just see patches of color and shapes as individual entities, but aggregates, So here are some of the principles discussed by the Gestalt school of thought. In the next slides, we'll talk about each principle and how it can help us when designing visualizations. Firstly, let's talk about the proximity. So the proximity principle talks about how, as people, we tend to think of objects that are physically close together as belonging to part of a group. So already here in the picture underneath, we see three groups, and so because some of the dots are physically close together, we can already assume that they belong to that particular group. So in this graph, our brains automatically tell us that, okay, there might be a pattern in how the bars are positioned because of their physical closeness to each other. And this is how it can be used in visualization. So without any labels or cues, we can assume that, okay, these are groups. So I can then use the proximity principle in visualization. So charts representing same matrix should be close together, so that we can already assume that they are in that group. And then when you introduce things like your titles, legends, and filters, so those should be close to the charts that they are representing, so that your audiences don't have to struggle to figure out, okay, this title belongs to which craft, or where's the legend, certain things like that. So using the proximity principle, it helps so that people can actually see what is representing what. So the second principle is the similarity principle. So this one states that objects that are of similar color, shape, size, or orientation are perceived as related or belonging to a particular group. In that example of the groupings, we saw that, okay, we have 3 groups, but here now the dots are colored. So our eyes already assume that, okay, somehow the purple dots are related to each other, and then the black dots are related to each other, even though they are not closely put together. So that's how the similarity principle works. So in this bar graph, although the bars of the same color are not in proximity to each other, our brains already suggest like they share common characteristics. So how can then we use the similarity in visualization? So you can use color to highlight similar characteristics. So then this will direct your audience's attention to elements that you consider significant. So that's how similarity works. Let's talk about the third principle, which is the enclosure principle, where now it assumes that we as people, we as audiences, we think of objects that are physically enclosed together as belonging to part of a group. For instance, in the example here, we can see that there are some dots that have been highlighted by the color purple. So we can already assume that there's something different about those shaded dots than the rest of the dots. So that's how enclosure works. So in an example here, we can see that the bars that are enclosed, they might mean something different. It's like they are separated from the other bars that are not enclosed. So how can we apply this in our visualization? So you can use this principle to group connected charts with a border. Like for instance, when you were developing a dashboard and you were presenting KPIs on a top, so KPIs that maybe are talking about something similar characteristics or category, you could have a border across them so that somebody looking at your dashboard can see that this form part of a group. And so you can also highlight other specific parts of a chart if you're doing a chart comparing actual versus target. So that's how the enclosure principle works. Let's talk about the fourth one, which is closure. So the closure indicates that people perceive a set of individual elements as a single recognizable shape. So when parts of a whole are missing, our eyes fill in the gap. So here we are assuming that this is a circle. Like our eyes see that as a circle, even though it's just a set of lines that are just put there. It's not a circle, but we, like the principle says, we want to fill in that gap. So in visualization, the enclosure principle is also very important because it helps us to remove unnecessary elements from our charts so that our data can stand out more. For example, we have a graph here that if you put your data in Excel, sometimes you may get something like this, and this is very distracting. So when you apply the closure principle to remove unnecessary elements to it, it can be like number 2, where you've removed the border, you removed the axis. So now your data kind of stands out more and we can focus on what is actually depicting. So that's what the closure principle is all about. Let's move on to the next one, which is continuity. So that one states that when looking at objects, our eyes seek the smoothest path and naturally create continuity in which we see, even when it may not explicitly exist. Because if I can make an example, somebody might see a line here going down. Like if you don't really try to delve that deeply into the lines, you can assume that that's how it's going, but it's actually going this way. So the similar one could be with here. So like we want to see the continuation of, like, our eyes are trying to look at that smoothest path, and so we naturally create that continuity. And so how can this then be used in crafts? So in charts, this principle primarily involves sorting and order. So we know that bar charts are more comprehensive when arranged from larger to small. Also, in this craft, there is no axis. So when we are reading the bar, like our eyes are still reading from downwards, from matcha to coffee, because we are already assuming that continuity. So this also applies to another example, but how that closure principle can be applied, because we've removed unnecessary elements that can be seen clearly so that our data can stand out. Let's talk about the next principle, which is the connection principle. So the connection states that we tend to think of objects that are physically connected as part of a group. So this principle apparently holds more influence than common colors and common shapes. So when looking at this image, even if the dots share the same color, like these dots share the same color, our initial perception is we are not going to think that they are somehow related, we tend to think that the dots that are connected by the line, those ones are connected, even though now we have like dots that are of bigger size. We have a square there. We also have the ones that are colored by purple, but automatically our eyes just relate the ones that are connected by line as being related. So this principle is especially evident in networks and line crafts. So we have an example here of a craft that just shows some dots that are way down there. We don't really see where the path is going. We can't really assume, but because of the lines in the second craft, we can understand that the dots are interconnected and they are leading us to see the order in our data. So these are the principle, the 6 principles of the Gestalt school of thought of perception. So we're going to try and put this in practice. So as we learned from this brief overviews that the Gestalt principles help us understand how people see, which we can then use to identify necessary elements and ease the process of our visual communication. So let's just put these principles in practice. So this is a chart that represents workshop attendance by age and gender. So if you put your data in Excel, this is a graph that it will pick for you. But the graph can do with a little bit of TLC. So let's just try and apply some of the Gestalt principles that we've just learned to try and improve this graph. Let's talk about the proximity. So the proximity states that bars representing the same matrix should be close together. So we see that the bars representing people aged 15 to 19 have been put close together. Those that are representing 20 to 24 years are put together. So then you can really, it's easier for your eyes to see, okay, this is where the people aged this age are, and so. So the next one that is used here is similarity. So similarity states that objects of a similar color are perceived as related. So then we have here blue for males and orange for females. So even though the males and females are not in proximity, you can already see where they are at because of their color. So another thing to note is that at times it won't be possible to use all the principles in one graph. So you just have to see which principle can be adapted for your designs. Another principle here is the closure principle. The closure principle states that you have to remove unnecessary elements from charts so that your data can stand out more, which is very important. So here are some of the elements that we can remove in this chart that are just busy. So before you actually remove elements and items, you can ask yourself, okay, will removing this element change the meaning and interpretation of my data? If not, then you can remove it. So after removing all the noise, our chart has become more clear and easy to focus our audience's attention, but there's still more that needs to be done. Firstly, the chart has no title, so the audience wouldn't understand what the graph is representing. Secondly, after removing the axis, it will be hard for anyone to determine the data being represented in the bars. So let's just make those improvements and see. So because the main theme of designing is always to consider our audience, we need to be smart about how we use their brain power. To be honest, people are tired. People are busy. So leveraging their cognitive load is very, very important. So according to Cole, cognitive load can be thought of as a mental effort that's required to learn new information. So you have to understand how remembering the types of audiences, how is a novice going, what's the cognitive load that a novice is going to require in order to understand your visualization. So those are some of the things you have to think about. So we can see that adding the title to the graph ensures that your audience isn't working too hard to figure out what the graph is representing, and also adding data labels ensures that they know the scale of the bars. They don't need to work too hard to understand your graph, meaning you have already focused their attention with little effort, and you've reduced the cognitive load that is required for them to actually understand your graph. That means they pay more attention than really raking their brains into your visualization. So this is how a chart looks like after making the changes, but it can still be better. Remember, we are designing with purpose. Keyword design. We are designing here. We are designing our visualizations because we want decisions to be made. So let our charts do the talking. Let your visual do the talking. If you've designed your visualization really well, it can actually do the work for you, where you don't really need to make more explanations into it. So this is a more improved version of our graph, the previous one. So this graph focuses the audience's attention and clarifies the message. What is also important is that it already prompts the audience to acting, so it has those it gives them ideas of decisions that they can make, so they don't need to wonder what their next steps are, as the visual already did all the talking. So as you remember, we're still talking about Tabo's case. His case was to present now data to a visualization to the principal about the data that he's collected. So let's see how Tabo can improve his chart. So using Tabo's example, this is what may be shown by Excel if he populated his data. However, in as much as the graph is still pursuing its purpose, it's not very appealing in design. At the end of the day, we still want to grab our audience's attention. So here is how I would make improvements on the graph. Because this is a rating scale and we are expecting to see a linear increase, then we can adapt the continuity principle here so that audiences can see that the scale moves to a lesser to a more, like it moves from disagree to agree. And then you can see, it seems like more people, more respondents have actually believed that there is a need for a tuck shop at Citibank High School, and then that will, I think then the principal can actually see and know. The chart already tells her that okay, make that decision to approve that tuck shop. So as we close off our session, here are some of the available tools that can be used for designing visualizations. Sometimes it may require using more than one tool to create a visual you want, and some of these tools are free. So this is not all the tools that are available out there. This is just some of the tools that I happen to have used in some of the visualizations that I've done. And before we close off our sessions, I just wanted to recap on what we have learned this season. As I said, this session is our last session for this season. Firstly, in episode 1, we introduced you to Tabo, an entrepreneur who wanted to establish a tuck shop at his local high school. And in the next episode, we followed Tabo's journey. And so in episode 2, we discussed what needs to be included in the proposal. Because remember, he was writing a proposal to the principal. So episode 2 was actually a 4-part series that really delved deeply into some of the proposal's content. And then in episode 3, we talked about how we could collect meaningful data through surveys. We also talked about how we can develop visualizations that drive decisions in episode 4. And lastly, in this episode, we've touched on aspects of designing with purpose. And as we close off the season, I really hope that the content we've shared will be beneficial to you as you continue your research journey. I also include all the episodes, the link to all the episodes under this video in the description so that you find them easily. And having said that, really we are just wrapping up the season, and we're just grateful for the support that you've continued to show us as we learn. We continue to learn together. This is a learning journey. So yeah, see ya in the next